Okay, hello everybody. This is our first FRAPPY day. Just want to kind of go over some basics here of what this is entailing. The acronym FRAPPY stands for Free Response AP Problem, and I think to make it a better sounding word, they put the Y at the end, and so they threw in a yay or ya there, okay? So these FRAPPY problems are essentially free response questions that were on previous AP statistics tests. And when you are assigned a FRAPPY in this class, it's one of the most important things that we do all year. I mean, by the time we get to the end of the year, you will have worked out so many FRAPPYs. The important part to these FRAPPYs, and you're going to see because I'm going to model this for you here today, is once you've completed a FRAPPY, I'm then going to have you use the rubric, the exact same rubric that the graders would use, and I'm going to have you score yourself, okay? Now, let me be clear here with what the expectation is. You are not going to be docked points on a FRAPPY if you make mistakes. And even if you make mistakes and let's say that you didn't score great on a particular free response question, okay? What I'm most interested in is that, one, when you are completing the free response question, that you are trying to answer it to the best of your ability, okay? Please know that, trying to look up the rubric and using that to answer, it's not going to help you, okay? We're trying to kind of model what's happening here on the test, and I'll tell you there are 6 free response questions on the AP statistics test. Generally, you should be spending no more than 15 minutes on each free response question, okay? So it's always a good idea when you work on these to kind of set a timer and allow yourself about 15 minutes to work on it, okay? Again, I'm asking that you answer it to the absolute best of your ability, and then, and I'll show you how to do this, we're going to model this today with this problem here, you're going to look up the rubric online. The College Board has on their website all the rubrics all the way back from the very beginning of when they started AP Stats. And I have a link to these rubrics on my website, and I'll show you where that's at as well. I want you to use the rubric to score your response, okay? This right here, using the rubric to score your response, is where you guys are going to get in the graders' heads, which is where you want to be, because you want to know, what are they looking for? What are they going to dock me for? What is considered full credit and what is considered like partial credit, okay? And then what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to make corrections. Like once you've tried it on your own and then you're scoring yourself on the rubric, I want you to use a pen and I want you to make corrections to your response so that it's brought up to what would be considered full credit had you done that on the AP test, okay? But I want you to score your original response. So in AP Stats, each free response question is worth 4 points. You can either get a 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Based on your original response, maybe you got a 1 out of 4. That's fine. Score yourself a 1 out of 4. That doesn't mean that's what your grade is on that assignment. I'm looking at, did you use the rubric and score yourself appropriately? Okay, so I do want you to make corrections in pen, but I don't want you to then score yourself 4 out of 4. Your grade on these FRAPPYs is not how well you've answered the question, but how well you have then used the rubric to score your original response. And of course, I do want you to make those corrections so that you have, kind of a complete correct problem to go back and look at. So let's look at this first question here. This ties in really, really nicely to what we learned in the very first section about telling whether there is an association between two categorical variables or not. Okay, it says here, using data from the 2000 census, a random sample of 348 U.S. residents between the age 18 and older were selected. Among the variables recorded were your gender, your housing status, whether you rented or owned, and your marital status, whether you were married or not married. And that part here will come in later in another part to this problem. The two-way table below summarizes the relationship between gender and housing status. So you can see here we have the gender across the top. We've got whether they owned or rented across the side here. Okay, we have these totals in the margins. And typically the way these AP free response questions work is usually part A is relatively simplistic. What you will notice the more you do these is that these problems, the parts tend to build. So a lot of times your answer to part A, they're wanting you to use that in part B. Now you'll see this on the rubrics. If you answer part A wrong, it doesn't mean that you then can't get any other parts right. If you use an incorrect answer from, say, part A in part B, but you used it correctly in part B, you're going to be given credit for part B. Okay, so part A is asking what percentage of the males in this sample own their home. Okay, so this is only talking about the males. Okay, so we are looking exclusively at that column. We're looking at out of the 182, what percentage of those owned their home. Okay, so we're interested in the 132 out of 182. If I type that into the calculator, change that into a percent, I'm looking at 72.5%. Okay, now we'll look at the rubric and see if what I wrote there is considered enough work to support that answer, but that's what I'm going to go with for part A right now. Okay, now part B says make a graph to compare the distribution of housing status for the males and females. Okay, now because it says that we are to compare the distribution of housing status, that means when I'm making, and our options here are to either make like a side-by-side bar graph or a segmented bar graph where they're stacked on top of each other. My preference is typically to do a side-by-side bar graph. I'm going to make a small key over here. Okay, one of the bars will be colored in solid and one will be empty. And because it's saying to compare the distribution of housing status, I'm going to be using housing status as my bars. Okay, so I'm going to let own be the solid bar and rent be the open bar here. Okay, so let me just clear this off up here. Okay, so I'm going to do the distribution of housing status for the males and females. Okay, so what I'm going to be calculating here is I'm going to calculate, okay, out of the males, how many owned? Well, we did that in part A, didn't we? We said, and I'm just going to jot this, I'm just going to squeeze this right here. We said 72.5% of the males owned. If I want to figure out of just the males, how many of them rented, I would take 50 and divide by 182. Okay, that's going to roughly give me 27.5%. Okay, so a lot more of the males seem like they're owning rather than renting. And now I'm going to do the same thing for the females. So for the females, I would take 122. I would divide by 166. 73.5% of the females own their home, while 26.5% of the females rent. Okay, so now I'm going to come down, and we know in AP Stats, anytime you are asked to make a graph, we need to always have proper labels here along our X and Y axis. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of accentuate here my X and Y axis. Okay, now I'm going to put male here and female here. Okay, and that's what I'm going to categorize as being gender. Okay. And then my percentages, I'm just going to count by tens. I'm going to put that along my y-axis. Okay, and I'm going to label what that is. Those are percents. Okay. Okay, now keep in mind over here, when I put a box, I'm going to have two boxes next to each other for the males. One is going to be the percentage of the males who own their home, and then the empty one will be the percent that rent. So we said the percent that own is 72.5. So I'm going to make this bar go up 72.5. Okay. And I'm just going to say there, that's colored in. And then the percent of males who rent is 27.5. So I'm going to go up roughly 27.5 there. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing for the females. 73.5% own, and 26.5% rent. Okay, so here's a graph. I've got all my axes labeled. I'm comparing the distribution of housing status for males and females. Okay, so let me move on to what part C is asking now. It says use your graph from part B. So again, you kind of see how this is, they always are kind of wanting us to use our answer from the previous step to get the next step here. It wants us to describe the relationship between gender and housing status. And what they're after here is they're wanting us to say, is there an association between gender and housing status? Now keep in mind, if there is an association, then that means if I told you, hey, someone is a male, then it would give you an inclination of whether they're more likely to rent or own compared to a female. If the males and females generally do the same thing, then there's not really an association between gender and housing status. Like knowing the gender of someone doesn't necessarily tell you the housing status, or vice versa, knowing the housing status. If I say someone owns their home, does that tell us, oh, that's more likely to be a male or that's more likely to be a female? So when you come back here, what you're going to be comparing and looking at is you're going to be looking at both these bars that are referencing owning homes, and you're going to say, okay, and just to make this a little bit easier to follow, I'm going to write at the top of these bars what the actual percentages are so that we see what that is exactly here. Okay, so as I look at this, I see, you know what? These are pretty close to the same height for the males and females that own. It doesn't seem like there's a drastic difference. Same thing for renting. There is not a drastic difference. These bars here are virtually the same height. Okay, so a good response for this, and I'm going to scroll where I've already written this here. A good response for this would maybe be something like this. Okay, and you got to think, you have to use good communication on the AP test. The graders are not allowed to assume that they know what you meant, okay? It's not an excuse to ramble, so don't just write for the sake of writing. Try to be concise, but make sure that you're thorough, okay? So I'm going to say there doesn't appear to be a strong association between gender and housing. Okay, now, if you just stop there, that is not sufficient. And you'll see that on the rubric, that you have to cite some evidence. What did you look at that led you to that conclusion? And I'm going to say, well, about the same percent of males and females, and then I'm going to say what those percentages are. And this word respectively just means that since I mentioned males first, this first number is the male percent, and this second number then is the female percent. So I'm going to say about the same percent of males and females, 72.5% and 73.5% respectively, own their homes. So knowing the gender doesn't tell us anything about the type of housing. Or I could word it the other way. Knowing the housing status doesn't tell us anything about what the gender would be. Okay? That's probably a really good answer to that in terms of just being able to support your conclusion. And this was my conclusion, that no, there's not a strong association between gender and housing status, but then I went on and supported that with a good justification. Okay, let's look at the last part here and then we'll break down the rubric. Okay, it says now, this is a different two-way table. This two-way table summarizes, instead of gender at the top, it's marital status, whether someone is married or not married, and comparing that to their housing status, okay? So it says, for the members of this sample, is the relationship between the marital status and housing status stronger or weaker than the relationship between the gender and the housing status that we described in part C? So we established in Part C that there really was not a strong association between gender and housing status. Let's take a look and see whether there is or is not between married and not married. Now, I will tell you this. It's not forcing us to make a graph on this. Okay, you'll notice it now. You could if you wanted to, but it just says to justify your choice using the data provided. So I'm going to do the same calculations I did before. Okay, so I'm going to figure it out for those who are married. Of the 212, what percent of them own their home? So I'm going to take 172 divided by 212, and that's 81.1%. Okay, and then those who rent is 18.9%. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing for married. I get 60.3% of those who are married own their home. Or I'm sorry, not married. And then 39.7% who are not married rent. Okay, now I don't really need to make the graph. If it's not forcing me to, I don't need to make the graph in order to be able to compare this. I can just look at this data and kind of be able to compare. Okay. So what I'm after here is I'm going to say, well, certainly as I compare owning married and not married, now it feels like there's much more of a drastic difference between these percentages. If you're not married, 60.3% own their home. But if you are married, wow, 81.1%. Okay, same thing here. There's a much more drastic difference between married and not married compared to renting. Okay. So I'm going to say a few things, okay? I'm going to start out by saying, well, it appears that the relationship between the marital status and housing is actually stronger than between the gender and the housing, okay? So there's my conclusion, and then here's my reasoning. This is because the differences in percentages for married and not married compared to housing status is much larger. Those differences from 81 to 60.3, that's much larger than for when the male and female were compared to the housing status. Remember back here, we said, well, right up here it is. Those were virtually the same. Okay, and then I'm just going to cite some of the data here. There appears to be an association between marital status and housing. If a person is married, there is a higher likelihood that he or she owns a home than if not married. And then I'm citing some of the data. 81.1% of married people own their home, opposed to the 60.3% of single people. Likewise, a larger portion of singles rent compared to the married people. Okay, this is all about citing evidence to support your answer. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the rubric. Okay, and I have given you the rubric for this, but I'm just going to show you this particular free response question. They're usually listed by what year that free response question showed up on the AP test and what number of problem it was. Was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 on the AP test? This one, I'm not sure where this rubric is at. I've tried to locate it. I have the rubric, but I just don't know where to go on the website. Okay, so I'm going to show you the website here, and then we'll take a look at the rubric. But if you were to go to my website, okay, dhsmcconnellapstats.weebly.com, okay, on my website, at the top, you're going to see all these different tabs, and all the way towards the right, there's one called Free Response Rubrics. Okay, you're going to tap Free Response Rubrics, and then where it says Rubrics for the FRAPPYs, you're going to click that, and that's going to direct you to the AP College Board site. Okay, you'll see how it says the AP Stats Past Exams. You're going to scroll on down, and you can see as you scroll, they give you these years. Now, starting in 2011 and earlier, there are two forms. You'll notice there's a Form B, and then there's just a 2011. If it's on the B test, it'll be called FRAPPY B. Okay, so you'll know which one to look. I'm just going to randomly pick a year here. I'm going to go to the 2004 free response question. Okay, so I'm going to open that up, and here's where you want to go. Right here where it says scoring guidelines. Did you catch that? Scoring guidelines. And you're going to open that up, and this is all 6 questions. It always starts with question number 1, and it will start out giving you the solution, which you'll want to look at. But a lot of times there's more than one way to do these problems. but you can look at the solution, but then you really want to look at the section that starts where it tells you how to score it. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our problem here, and I've given you the rubric, so let's go ahead and take a quick look here at the rubric. Okay, it gives you just what the intent of the question is, and then it gives you a model solution. Okay, you should not use the model solution to score yourself. It's fine to look at it to see, was I getting, and a lot of times you do need to look at this, but you need to also scroll down to where you see scoring. Okay, now there were 4 parts to this, A, B, C, D. Okay, typically each part is scored either an E for essentially correct, a P for partially correct, or an I for incorrect. Okay, an E, P, or I. You're going to write in the margin E, P, or I next to each part based on where you fell on the rubric. And then at the very bottom of this, it'll tell you if you got 3 E's and 1 P, then that means you scored a 3 out of 4 on the free response question. So let's look at this very quickly. You're going to get essentially correct on part A if your response correctly calculated the percentage of males that own their home. Ooh, look at this. And you showed work. Okay, you're going to drop down to only getting this partially correct if you have the correct calculation for the percentage of males who own their home, but you don't show any work. Okay, or if you show work, but you made this error here. Okay, so you really want to read through these rubrics here. So what that means is, I'm going to scroll back here. Back to this, if you only wrote 72.5%, you're getting a P on this because I included showing the numbers I divided to get that. That gets me an E for essentially correct. Okay, all right, let's go back to the rubric here. Okay, for part B, it says essentially correct. And here's why you do have to kind of look at the solution and the scoring rubric. It doesn't tell you in the scoring what that correct answer is. It just says you get an E if you calculated it correctly and you showed your work. But when you look back here, you can look at this and you can see, okay, here's the work and here's the answer. Okay. All right, part B. Essentially correct. This was when we made our graph. If the response includes an appropriate type of graph, bar graph, segmented graph, it looks reasonably accurate, you have all the proper labels, and it makes it easy to compare the conditional distribution of housing status for each gender. Okay. Again, you can take a look at what they have here for part B, but it looks awfully similar to what we have there. Okay, and then you would go to your response, and in the margin, you would simply write down either an E, P, or I. Okay, once again, it is fine if you guys at the beginning are getting I's on some of these parts here. Okay, let's go to part C very quickly here. Okay, part C, essentially correct if the response correctly compares the appropriate conditional distributions and concludes that there is no association or a very, very weak association because the distributions are so similar. Okay, notice you had to say why. Okay, you couldn't just say, oh, there's no association between these. Okay, partial is if you correctly stated that there was no association, but then you don't explain because those were similar. Okay, so you get docked when you don't do that justification. Okay, it's always worth looking at these extra notes that are at the bottom of the rubric. There are more than one way a lot of times to do these problems. Okay, I'm going to let you guys go ahead and read part D there, but I just want to draw your attention here at the end to what you would do on this particular problem is every E is 1 point, every P is a half of a point. Now, you can't get a 3.5 on a free response question. So when you go through, if you add up and you get your total to say be 3.5 or 2.5, then the graders are going to look and say, okay, did you at least use good communication? Did you use good context when you were explaining things? And they might bump you up to a 3 or bump this up to a 4, okay? But they'll bump you either up or down depending on how good your communication was in your responses. Okay, you do have one FRAPPY that I want you to try here tonight. It is the 2009 FRAPPY, question number 1. And I'll just tell you that when you are going to go find the rubric, you again would go to my website, you go right here to 2009, open, and then you're going to click on scoring guidelines, okay? And that's going to take you to the rubric.